You take God out of your life and you lose protection. You lose your protection. You see, we can build up our military might all we want to, but if God is not our shield, we have lost our greatest protection. Not only does God want us and Abraham to know that he is our peace and protection, but God also wants us to know that he is our prosperity and our blessing. God said to Abraham, I saw how you refused to take the king's gifts and rewards for your valiant leadership in bringing their people and families back from war. I saw how you gave your tithes to the king of Salem, the servant of God. And I just want you to know, Abraham, that I have a blessing for you. And it's not a small blessing. It's an exceedingly great reward. It is a blessing that is above and beyond your expectation. It's a blessing that's going to blow your mind, a blessing that is beyond your wildest imagination. It's an abundant life blessing. It is an overflowing kind of blessing. It is a cup runneth over kind of blessing. This is a blessing that is beyond the car, the cash, and the crib. You have those for the mere fact that you are mine. God says to Abraham, this blessing is connected to the promise I gave you in the beginning about your heir and your inheritance. As for your heir, Abraham, I promised you in Genesis 12:2 that I will make of you a great nation. Then in Genesis 13:16, I promised that I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth. Then as it relates to your inheritance, Abraham, I promised you in Genesis 12:7 that unto thy seed I will give this land. But it seems as if the promised blessing of having a son, an heir, has faded as the years passed. Each year, Abraham and Sarah get older. The possibility of having a child decreases. That promise was given 10 years earlier, and at that time, Abraham was 75. And here they are 10 years later, and there is no son. This is why we see Abraham responding the way he does in verse 2, saying, God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Here, God is about to bless Abraham beyond measure, and Abraham confronts God with this question. Abraham has the audacity to ask God this question, saying, what will you give me, Lord? What can you give me, Lord, seeing I go childless? In other words, God, you promised 10 years ago that you would give me a child. Where is the child, God? What good is all of the other blessings, God, without a child to pass the blessings down to? Be honest with yourselves, church. What good is the car, the cash, the crib, if you don't have anybody to pass it down to? What good are the things, the blessings? What good are the material wealth? What good is the spiritual blessings, the love of God, the peace of God, the salvation of God, if you don't have anyone to pass the blessings down to? It's not that Abraham did not have faith. This situation was a test of Abraham's faith. Abraham was a man of great faith, but great faith is not untested faith. In fact, you don't know what kind of faith you have if you've never been tested. It's the test of faith that helps to strengthen your faith. Abraham sounds pessimistic. He sounds hopeless. He sounds doubtful and depressed and frustrated. Why? Because his faith is being tested. God promised him a child 10 years ago. Then God comes back 10 years later saying, I'm about to bless you exceedingly. I have a great blessing for you. Abraham said, I have not received the first blessing yet. Lord, what will you give me seeing I go childless? his faith is tested by at least three things in the text. And I believe our faith is tested in this same way. First, Abraham's faith is tested by God's inaction. Somebody say inaction. Abraham says, I go childless. Lo, these 10 years I look and I still have no child. God's inaction does not mean that he will never fulfill his promise. God's delay does not mean denial. God's delay should strengthen our faith. God's delay also increases the size of our blessings. Have you ever asked God to bless you and it was delayed? And lo and behold, when it came, it was far greater than you ever expected it to be. He delayed the job you thought you should have had. But when he did bless you, it exceeded that job, that position, that blessing. God's inaction sometimes tests our faith, but it should also strengthen our faith. That's what Mama meant when she said, you can't hurry, God. You just have to wait. He's a God you can't hurry. He'll be there, don't you worry. May not come when you want him, but he's always on time. Abraham was tested by God's inaction. Secondly, Abraham's faith was tested by inequity. Abraham reminded God that to me, no seed has been given. Others have been given seed. Others have been given a child and children, but not me. It's always a trying experience to observe others who, in spite of the fact that they're not living for God as we are, and yet they experience the blessings which we do not experience. I mean, we're married. We cannot have a child. And plenty of folk out there who are not married. And they're popping them out like 3s and 4s. This is Abraham's dilemma. He looked at Lot, his nephew. Lot had children, both sons and daughters, but he was certainly not living for God, to say the least. Abraham did not have children, specifically a son, even though he was living for God. The heathen living around Abraham were also having children. They worshiped their idols. They lived unholy lives, and they still have experienced the blessings of childbirth and having a child but godly Abraham does not. Abraham's servant had children, and yet Abraham had no offspring as they did. Sometimes our faith is tested by inequity. This was Hannah's dilemma. When Elkanah's other wife, Phinehas, had children and Hannah had none. Each year Hannah came to the temple and prayed for a child, but each year she had no child. But we know that the day finally came for Abraham and Sarah. The day finally came for Hannah, and their seed was better than all the others put together. Why? Because through Isaac came a holy nation. Through Samuel came a prophet, a priest, and a judge during Israel's most critical time in history. So for those of you who are still waiting, your day will come. Right now, others seem to prosper, and it may seem so unfair. But when your Isaac comes, you will realize that you have received the greater blessing. I know God's inaction and inequity has tested your faith, but God told me to tell you to hold on. Keep the faith. Your breakthrough is on the way. Then there's a third thing that seems to test Abraham's faith, and that is inability. Our faith is sometimes tested by our own inability to produce. When Abraham said, "Seeing I go childless," it became the inevitable that he and Sarah was unable to produce. Yes, as the years went by, inability stared Abraham right in the face. So much so that he believed that the heir of his house would be the chief servant, Eleazar of Damascus, and not his own son. God does not want us to glory in our inability, nor in our own strength when he blesses us. He wants the glory. Sometimes God disables us so that we can be totally helpless apart from him, so that we can lean and depend on him. God does this for Abraham and Sarah. That's why Sarah laughs later on when time came for her to have a child. That's why Abraham is frustrated in this text. That's why Abraham is pessimistic. He feels the inability to make it happen. But all of this gives God more glory. If we could do it, we wouldn't need God. Their extreme inability will show the greatness of God's power. Abraham's faith was tested by God's inaction and inequity and his own inability. That's why Abraham responds the way he does in verse 2, saying, "Lord, what will you give me?" Unfruitful Abraham, me, old and gray Abraham, me and my wife who has passed childbearing age, me, Lord, what will you give me? Abraham has a narrow view of God's blessing. Abraham has a pessimistic view of God's blessing. And the reason he does is because of where he is. Somebody asked, where is he? Abraham is inside of his tent. When he starts complaining to God and making his request known to God, he's in his tent. Small little tent. Which is to say, he had a small view of God's ability and power. He was inside his tent when he said, "Lord, what will you give me?" He was inside his tent when he said, "Lord, will you give me a child?" Abraham had a legitimate complaint. He had a legitimate request. "Will you give me a child so I can pass on to him your blessings?" But his request was too narrow, too small. His request could only fit inside the little tent he was sitting in. And God said, "Abraham, what I'm about to give you won't even fit in the small tent you're in." God wanted to give him a child, but not just for his benefit. Not just for his family. This child will be a blessing to the world.